This is the Little Street, which Johannes Vermeer painted sometime around 1657. Over here is View of Delft, painted a little later, maybe 1660. Delft was Vermeer's hometown, and its name comes from the word delve, because the town grew up around the dugout canals we see here in the foreground. These two paintings are outliers. Vermeer mostly painted domestic interiors. For instance, Girl Interrupted at Her Music, or over here, The Guitar Player. And we could fly around here all night looking at these, but there's something in particular that I want to show you. This painting's called The Procuress. Notice how these three figures are connected, fixated on the same interaction, with a dark background behind. To the side is a fourth character, seemingly removed from the painting, seated in front of a bright background and looking directly back at the viewer. There's reason to think that this man is Vermeer himself, who then would have only been 24 years old. There was a convention in Dutch art of the period for artists to insert themselves in a role not unlike a third-party narrator outside of the rest of the painting, like in this painting by Van Mieris. And in Vermeer's work, The Art of Painting, the painter bears a distinct resemblance to our friend, making it seem likely that these two figures are in fact Vermeer himself. Vermeer as a historical figure is hard to access. For centuries, he was known as the Sphinx of Delft, an inexplicably masterful painter with no known teacher about whom almost nothing was known. It was as if a handful of the finest works of art in the world were inserted into history without a creator. But from decades spent in Dutch archives, scholars have pieced together more and more of this man's life. Uniquely, it seems that Vermeer did not study under any single master, and that he was a rare autodidact who drew from a variety of influences. He spent his entire life in Delft, married and had 11 surviving children, made a living as an art dealer and painter, sold many of his works to a single patron, faced financial ruin when war devastated the region, and died penniless at age 43. His works scattered into the wind in the years after his death. His family retained none of them, though many of them cohabited in the collection of Peter van Rauwen, Vermeer's patron who bought as many as 21 of his paintings. It was this patronage which, for a time, allowed Vermeer the financial freedom to paint as slowly as he needed to, and with the finest pigments, like this ultramarine, made with the lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. On Van Rauwen's death, his works passed to his daughter Magdalena, and when Magdalena died young, they became the property of her husband Jacob Decius. On his death in 1695, those 21 Vermeers went to auction, marking the day when Vermeer's works were scattered into history. The Decius auction would be the last historical node where much of Vermeer's oeuvre was correctly identified and gathered in one place for hundreds of years. In the years after the auction, collections disseminated and paintings changed hands as collectors sold or went bankrupt or died. Often, Vermeer's works were deliberately reattributed to other, more famous Dutch artists to increase their value, and his legacy was scattered into the wind, almost lost to history only a few decades after his death. Documents of the 1696 auction still survive, where we find descriptions of 21 of Vermeer's works, and the price they sold for, mixed in with the rest of the estate. Looking at their translations, we can try and match them to known Vermeers. For instance, item 1, described as a young lady weighing gold in a box by J. Vandermeer of Delft, which we can confidently say refers to what we call woman holding a balance, or item 2, a maid pouring out milk, which of course describes the milkmaid. But when we get to item 3, it gets hazy. Portrait of Vermeer in a room with various accessories, sold for 45 guilders. Conceivably, this could be the art of painting, but the low price hints to us that this must have been a small painting, and the art of painting is quite large. And while the art of painting may well include Vermeer, it can hardly be described as a painting of Vermeer. We can likely conclude then that this describes a lost self-portrait of Vermeer which disappeared from history sometime after the Decius auction. For a number of the listings, we can make reasonable guesses for which painting is being described, but other instances are quite unclear. Item 9, for instance, describes a merry company in a room, vigorous and good, sold for 73 guilders. Scholars guess that this is Girl with the Wine Glass, but it could easily suit The Concert as well, or several others, or a lost painting. All we have to go off is a vague description by an unknown cataloger and a price that suggests a painting of moderate size, so it's impossible to be certain. Another lost painting must be item number 5, in which a gentleman is washing his hands in a perspectival room, sold for 95 guilders. No known Vermeer painting features such a subject, so on some unknown day after 1696, it became lost, probably forever. The descriptions for items 32 and 33, a view of a house standing in Delft, and a view of some house, could both only describe the Little Street and no other known Vermeer. Most likely one of them was the Little Street and the other is lost, though conceivably they could both describe works lost to history. Item 28 describes a trony or genre portrait in antique dress, uncommonly artful, and it's thought to refer to what is now Vermeer's most iconic work, Girl with a Pearl Earring. But as with so many other items in this auction, we just don't know for sure. Numbers 39 and 40 essentially say ditto, and we do know of a few other tronies by Vermeer, but are they The Girl in the Red Hat and Study of a Young Woman, or are they portraits which we've lost? In fact, out of all the 21 Vermeers sold that day, we can only be reasonably sure of the identity of about 7 of them, with decent guesses for another 11, while the other 3 are simply black holes. Part of the trouble with finding Vermeers is how frequently they are reattributed to other artists. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the name Vermeer meant far less than Rembrandt or De Hoek. In 1718, the art historian Arnold Houbraken published his definitive history of 17th century Dutch artists, but Vermeer is almost totally absent from its pages, mentioned only once in passing. Though his paintings survived, within decades, Vermeer himself was becoming forgotten. In 1842, a French art critic named Théophile Thoré visited the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague and was particularly struck by one work, View of Delft. He learned from the catalogue that the painter was one Jan van der Meer of Delft, an unfamiliar name. Though moved by the painting, Thoré didn't dwell long on the unknown painter. 7 years later, owing to his political activity, Thoré was exiled from France. In the years he spent abroad in Germany, Belgium, England, and especially the Netherlands, he encountered more works by this Vermeer. In time, Thoré became consumed with the desire to elevate this obscure Dutch painter to the international acclaim owed to him, and he spent the rest of his life resuscitating the painter. In 1866, Thoré hosted a gallery in Paris where he attempted to reunite Vermeer's oeuvre. See these 7 paintings? Thoré spent years traversing Europe to connect unidentified Vermeers with interested collectors, but look closely, there's a problem. These 3 paintings aren't by Vermeer of Delft. This one is Jacobus Verel's street scene, this is Dirk Jan van der Meer's view of dunes, and this is Dirk Jan van der Land's rustic cottage. In striving to find Vermeer, Thoré cast a wide net. He identified more than 70 paintings as Vermeers, including the works of a different painter named Vermeer, and it's been the task of art historians in the interceding century to sift out the 35 genuine works we have today, many of which Thoré himself never saw. It isn't hard to see why Thoré struggled to isolate Vermeer's art. How can you isolate the style of an artist that made such disparate works? He always hunted for the essential Vermeer, a single work that encapsulated who Vermeer the artist was. But he never found it, and you might say that no such work ever existed. When Thoré died in 1869, he was the proud owner of 3 genuine Vermeers. 23 years after his death, his collection was auctioned off, and his 3 Vermeers went their separate ways. Woman Standing at a Virginal went to the Gallery of London, and after a few years in a private collection, the second painting, Woman Seated at a Virginal, became its companion. The third painting, well, we'll come to that. If we step into the present and walk backwards, we can piece together the provenance of known Vermeers. Some are relatively simple. The Girl with the Wine Glass was probably bought at the Decius auction in 1696, and though documents don't reveal the buyer, 15 years later it shows up in the collection of Duke Herzog Anton Ulrich of Brunswick, and conveniently, over 300 years later, it remains in the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum in Brunswick. Sometimes it's not hard. For other Vermeers, though, provenance is incredibly precarious or altogether unknown, hinging on vague, anonymous scribbles in ledgers from centuries ago. Records of girl reading a letter at an open window, for instance, are only found in the 1896 Dresden document stating that it was sold to a Peter van der Lip in 1712, and then it was successively misattributed to Rembrandt in 1753, and then Flinck in 1783, and then De Hoek in 1856. The faintest trace of a signature can be seen to the right of the woman's skirt. And as Vermeer's signature came to be recognizable with his resurgence in the 1860s, it was finally re-identified as a Vermeer in Dresden, where it remained until 1945, when the Soviets seized it in their westward advance, before it was finally restituted to the Dresden State Art Museum in 1955, where it remains today. Of the 34 undisputed Vermeers we have today, no more than 18 of them passed through the Decius auction. So what about the rest of them? The earliest known Vermeer is probably Diana and her companions, painted as early as 1653 when Vermeer was only 21 years old. There's no record of its existence at all in its first few centuries. The remaining trace of Vermeer's signature on the stone shows evidence of being modified to say "in Mays" in an apparent attempt to reattribute the work to a more valued painter. It was sold as a Nicola Mays painting to a Neville Goldsmith in 1866, before being sold to the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague. When records fail to establish provenance, other clues can help. In this case, the directors of the Mauritshuis Museum verified it as a genuine Vermeer by chemically analyzing the paint used with another Vermeer, Christ in the House of Martha and Mary. That work first appears in the records around 1880 when a furniture salesman bought it in an antique store for only £8. When a later owner put it up for exhibit in London, the signature in the lower left was identified as Vermeer's, and by then the name of Vermeer of Delft meant quite a lot. Much of the mystique of Johannes Vermeer comes from the way he's withheld from us. So few Vermeers survive. Many of his peers produced hundreds of paintings, but we have less than 3 dozen Vermeers. Many of his peers produced self-portraits. In fact, Rembrandt's self-portraits alone outnumber Vermeer's entire oeuvre. But we only have one speculative image which may or may not be Johannes. Accordingly, each Vermeer is incredibly precious, and the looming chance that unseen Vermeers could someday re-emerge is incredibly tantalizing. And that hope isn't entirely misplaced. We really could find more. And according to some, we already have. In 1969, a grad student at Columbia named Joan Niesman was assigned to catalog a collection of paintings for an upcoming exhibit. One of the paintings was St. Praxedis, a painting bought by Jacob Reeder in New York in 1943. It's unknown where the painting was at any earlier point. Niesman wrote in her catalog that the painting bore the signature Meer 1655, and upon scientific analysis, this was suggested to be part of the original paint structure. So she concluded, it's a Vermeer, right? But the painting itself is a copy of an earlier work by the Italian painter Felice Ficcarelli. Italy is a long way from Delft, and it's thought that Ficcarelli's work has never left Italy, so how could Vermeer have copied it? Duplicating works of art wasn't an uncommon method of study for young painters, and Vermeer would have only been about 22 years old in 1655, so it seems possible that he would have made this, but the question of how remains. It's possible that it's a copy of Ficcarelli's work, an explanation which some Vermeer scholars in the 1970s and 80s found convincing. But further scientific analysis suggested that while the signature was old, it seemed less aged than the paint below it. This poses another problem, because if Vermeer didn't paint it, then somebody must have added his signature later, except it would hardly be worth reattributing it to Vermeer prior to the 1860s, because his name wasn't valuable yet. There's also another strange detail. In the 70s, analysts wrote of a faintly visible second signature on the painting that they thought may have said Vermeer after Raposo, which was the nickname of Ficcarelli. But a second signature would be incredibly unusual in any Dutch art of the period, and nobody has been able to locate this alleged second signature anywhere on the painting in decades, so it's unclear what these earlier analysts were referencing. Ultimately today, few Vermeer scholars believe that St. Praxedis is genuine, though a few went to their graves defending it. It lives in the category of plausibility with another work, a young woman seated at a virginal. Unlike Praxedis, this unsigned work is coming to be broadly accepted as a genuine Vermeer. It seems that the reason for its earlier exclusion was just because it's not that nice. It's clumsier. The hands are said to look like pig trotters. Modern scholarship has come around to the idea that this was one of Vermeer's final works, perhaps his last surviving painting, during which time he was under great financial pressures, perhaps after his primary patron had died and his country had been devastated by war. A recent development in Vermeer's catalog is the exclusion of Girl with a Flute. It's been exhibited as a Vermeer in the National Gallery of Art since 1942, but in the last 5 years, the museum's research team changed their mind. It's not, they say, a Vermeer, but a painting by someone who is acquainted with his methods. Compare it to Girl with a Red Hat. Challenging the notion that Vermeer never had any apprentices, they say that while technical mistakes relating to brushwork and underpainting disqualify Girl with a Flute from Vermeership, it displays an intimate knowledge of Vermeer's methods, as if it were painted by an apprentice. But plenty of experts outside the National Gallery disagree, saying that no documentary evidence supports the theory that he ever had an apprentice, and that these mistakes don't necessarily disqualify it from legitimacy. It seems likely that, moving forward, Girl with a Flute will be jettisoned from the catalog of Vermeer, as so many works were in the last century. The history of the paintings of Vermeer is indelibly bound to the history of Europe. Where powers rose, the most treasured artifacts of the continent followed. Money followed art, and then art followed money, as droves of forgers and con artists found ways to imitate the works of the old masters. The early decades of the 20th century saw a thrilling and tumultuous period of rediscovery, as the extraordinarily wealthy competed to acquire the rarest works, many of which were turning up in completely unexpected corners. The lucky person who might find an unknown Caravaggio or Velázquez would become incredibly wealthy overnight, so before long, the art market was saturated with fakes. Some were cheap and easily discovered, maybe old and insignificant works clumsily misattributed, or new shoddy works that made for poor imitations. Others were a bit more clever. Skilled artists could sell their works for far more if they could pass them off as old masterpieces. But a trained eye with the right tools could sift them out. Some, however, slipped through the cracks. Part of the problem was how much art critics thought they knew. Connoisseurship ruled over everything else. The idea that a master critic could gauge the legitimacy of a work just by staring at it for long enough. They expected certain features out of a Rembrandt or a Rubens or a Vermeer. Not just technical details, but genre and subject matter. And these expectations weren't just objective inferences. They reflected something about the critic and the society from which they came. So if a forger was skilled enough to imitate a master, clever enough to concoct methods to duck scientific detection, deceptive enough to anticipate what a critic would most want to discover, and had the connections to launder the forgery to appear legitimate, they could become unbelievably wealthy. Before the 1930s, there was only one painting by Vermeer depicting a biblical scene, Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. But over the next decade, as the Nazis scoured the continent hoping to find Christian works by Vermeer, more and more kept popping up. When Hitler acquired the art of painting in 1940, Reichsmarshal Gowing was jealous and wanted his own Vermeer. Lucky for him, Christ and the Adulteress, a newly certified Vermeer, had just come on the market and he snapped it up. With a handful of other biblical scenes, it represented a previously unknown collection of Vermeers, which art historians thought he must have painted for a secret Catholic church in Delft, and had survived together as a collection in the possession of shadowy art collectors for the last 3 centuries. When the Nazis fell in 1945, the Allies set to work repatriating art to the victims of Nazi looters, and hunted collaborators on the art market. Christ and the Adulteress was traced back to a mysterious artist and dealer from Delft named Hans van Meegeren, who was put on trial for collaboration. If found guilty, Meegeren faced heavy punishment. Instead, he shocked the art world by professing that Christ and the Adulteress was a forgery by his own hand. And not just that, he claimed at least 4 other Vermeers and 2 to hoax were his as well. Works like Supper at Emmaus, which the definitive connoisseurs of Vermeer proclaimed to be not just genuine Vermeers but his very finest works, were demonstrated to be forgeries when, at the trial, Van Meegeren painted another forgery, Jesus Among the Doctors, in the exact same style of the other forgeries. He knew exactly what the Nazis and their art critics were hoping to find, and he created just that. Van Meegeren was publicly celebrated for swindling both the Nazis and the elitist world of art criticism. Critics who had scorned the paintings under his own name were humiliated when he proved just how little they knew. Ultimately, Van Meegeren served a brief prison sentence and died a few years later. His Nazi sympathies overshadow any other legacy, but he did cause a genuine reckoning in the art world. The quasi-mythical power of connoisseurs to simply gaze at a painting to determine its merit was proven to be almost worthless, and in its place a new context-driven analysis grounded in provenance and scientific examination took root. The forgeries of Hans van Meegeren are remembered today as warnings of just how potent forgery can be. Looking at them now, they don't appeal to modern sensibilities and they come across as a bit flat and ugly. It's hard for us to understand how anyone, let alone the entire critical art community, could believe these to be genuine Vermeers. But they're not just paintings imitating Vermeer, they're forgeries pulling the style of Vermeer through the sensibilities and artistic gaze of the Nazis, tailor-made to deceive them. Remember Théophile Thoré? 2 of his 3 Vermeers wound up at the Gallery of London, but the third went to auction and was obtained by Isabella Gardner Stewart, who took it home to the Boston mansion that would become the Isabella Gardner Stewart Museum. It used to hang in the corner of the Dutch Room, in the company of Rembrandt and Flink, but it doesn't anymore. On March 18, 1990, 2 men dressed as police officers tied up the security guards and stole 13 works of art, none of which have been seen again. 30 years later, the concert remains the most valuable stolen work of art in the world, and it's the only lost Vermeer whose face is known. There are at least 34 known Vermeers, 36 if you count these 2 questionable attributions. Conversely, there are at least 3 from the Decius auction that are indisputably gone: Gentleman Washing His Hands, A View of Some House, and his self-portrait. A Dutch painter of the generation after Vermeer's, named Michiel van Muscher, imitated some of Vermeer's paintings fairly closely, and we have 2 self-portraits by him, so it's possible that Vermeer's self-portrait was similar to one of these, but that's only a guess. A similar story is true of A View of Some House, which might be gleaned from one of Jan van der Land's cityscapes that were painted more than a century later. When an art dealer in Delft named Johannes de Alme died in 1657, his estate sale included a picture of the grave visitation by Vermeer, 20 guilders. We don't have a clue what this looked like. Was it a depiction of Easter Sunday or a more contemporary scene? Certainly it sounds more like his early works than his later domestic scenes, but we'll never know for sure. And in 1716, when another Delft collector named Van Berkel died, a Vermeer called Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury was sold off and then lost to history. It seems that we're missing some of the contributions to a portion of Vermeer's career dedicated to scenes of history and myth. There are some details within known Vermeers that we can't see. Girl with the Red Hat was painted over another portrait, and in the doorway of Made Asleep, X-rays reveal a dog looking back at the mysterious figure of a man. And then there are the artworks that are far more lost than any of these, works that we've never seen or heard of. Maybe they were forgotten or destroyed by war, or maybe, as has been suggested, there's one in the vault of an incredibly rich art collector waiting for its value to reach some unbelievable zenith before unveiling it to the world. Are there more works by Johannes Vermeer of Delft still waiting to be rediscovered centuries after his death? Does someone already have them? Are they hanging in our museums or in some forgotten attic? Or are the rest of the works from the hands of a mysterious painter dead for 350 years, as lost to us as he is?